what General Lee is going to put together here is a three-phase plan to try to defeat the Union and win the Battle of Gettysburg, thus winning the Civil War for the South. And phase one is going to be a familiar plan. He again is going to order General Richard Ewell to try and take Culp's Hill. He still wants Culp's Hill, okay? The Confederates have gained a small amount of high ground at Seminary Ridge, which you can see on your sheet. But he still wants the high ground at Culp's Hill. So phase one is going to be the ordering of General Richard Ewell to take Confederate troops and assault Culp's Hill. And I do want to reiterate that if you look on your map, you can see a ridge called Seminary Ridge, and that is the only high ground that the Confederates have captured at that time. And what do they have on that high ground at Seminary Ridge? Cannons. Okay? Phase two, and you've got to have to pay attention a little bit to the line, because it starts right here with this nice little line right here. Phase two, General Lee ordered General Jeb Stuart and 5,000 cavalrymen on what they called a wide sweep attack around Culp's Hill, and he's going to hit the Union behind their lines. In other words, if you look at this map right here, which way are the Union soldiers facing? They're all facing this way. So he's going to come around, and the goal is, and you're going to see by the map, he's going to have trouble, but he's going to continue all the way through and hit right in the middle of the Union lines from behind. That's the plan. So General Lee orders General Jeb Stuart and his 5,000-man cavalry unit on a wide sweep attack from around Culp's Hill to behind Union lines. And then what Lee's going to do, phase three, and you can see it says Pickett's charge, but he's going to use a very large infantry force and attack the Union lines where you see that arrow. And who's going to be on the other side of the arrow behind the lines? Stuart. And the idea is to split the Union right in half, because Lee believes if he can split that Union right in half on the ridges, they will retreat back and eventually go back to Washington, D.C. So the three-phase plan is to capture Culp's Hill, get their artillery on top of there, and punish the Union lines from Culp's Hill with artillery. In the meantime, they've already captured Seminary Ridge, and I'll tell you later they're going to start shooting cannon fire onto Cemetery Ridge, from Seminary Ridge, to kind of loosen up the Union Army as Stuart comes around from the back and Lee and Pickett come from the front and squeeze them. Does that make sense, kind of? When you see the video on Tuesday, it'll make total sense to you. Okay, so that's the idea. Well, Lee's plan will begin at dawn, or 5 a.m., on July 3rd of 1863. So Lee's three-phase plan will go into effect at dawn, 5 a.m., on July 3rd, 1863. Now, what type of a battle are the Union going to be fighting here at Gettysburg on day 3? Type of a battle? Defensive battle. They own, that's northern soil. They're going to defend it. It will be the Confederates on the offensive on July 3rd, 1863. Now, here's the key. While the Confederates and General Ewell are trying to take Culp's Hill, Lee has ordered those 150 cannons that he has on Seminary Ridge to start firing at Cemetery Ridge at the Union forces to try to soften them up for this frontal and rear assault by himself and Jeb Stuart. So as General Ewell and the Confederates are trying to take Culp's Hill, Lee is firing cannon fire from Seminary Ridge, 150 cannons at Cemetery Ridge, where the Union forces are, to try to soften them up. Now, this cannon fire is so loud that you can hear it 150 miles away in Philadelphia. That's how loud these 150 Confederate cannons were as they pounded cannonballs into Cemetery Ridge. Now, let me ask you a question here. The other class answered this and I was a little bit surprised. So, here is Cemetery Ridge. The Union forces are facing this way and the Confederates are over here on Seminary Ridge firing cannon fire. Where do you think those men are located on that ridge? Where are all those Union troops located on the ridge? Where would you have them if you were commanding Union troops? Where would you put them? What'd you say? Absolutely, you'd put them back in here, wouldn't you? You wouldn't put them right on the ridge, would you? Aren't they pretty vulnerable right on the ridge? That's what Lee thought. Well, you know what Meade did? Lee thought that they'd be back. So what did Meade do? Moved them all up on the front of the ridge. All of these men were on the front of the ridge because he predicted that Lee would think that they would be back, which most people would. So this cannon fire that he's lobbing into the Union troops on Cemetery Ridge, is it hitting anybody? No, it's actually going over the ridge and harmlessly hitting land. So he's not doing the damage that he wants to be doing, okay? Nothing's really happening for him there. Does that make sense? So this artillery unit on Seminary Ridge is simply firing cannonballs over the top of the men on Cemetery Ridge because he's misjudged them. So far it's not working well for him, this plan. Well, let's go back to Culp's Hill. What's happening on Culp's Hill is, who has cannons on Culp's Hill? The Union. And what are they doing with those cannons as those Confederates are trying to take Culp's Hill? Firing at them along with infantry shooting as well. And these advancing Confederate soldiers are just getting crushed. The carnage is unbelievable. So things aren't going well on Culp's Hill either, as the Union artillery is battering these advancing Confederate soldiers, causing much havoc and much carnage upon the South. Now basically, when you look at Culp's Hill on July 3rd of 1863, the Confederate assault on Culp's Hill makes very little progress at great loss of what? Life. Very good, Confederate life. So Culp's Hill's not going well for Lee either. The Union artillery is pounding those Confederate soldiers as they're trying to advance on the top of Culp's Hill, and they're making very little progress with great loss of life. During the assault on Culp's Hill, nearly 2,000 rebel soldiers were killed or wounded. During that assault on Culp's Hill, nearly 2,000 rebel casualties, either killed or wounded. On that assault of Culp's Hill, 2,000 Confederate casualties, killed or wounded. Among the killed are Wesley Culp, who dies on the hill that bears his name. So among those Confederates killed in this siege at Culp's Hill are Wesley Culp, who dies on a hill that bears his name. Now, General Lee doesn't really know how Phase 1 is going, because where is he? Preparing himself for Phase 3, right? In front of the ridge, in front of Cemetery Ridge. Well, not knowing what's going on in Culp's Hill, he initiates Phase 2. And Phase 2 is his plan of what? Of Jeb Stuart and the cavalry coming behind enemy lines and eventually meeting his infantry to split the Union line in half at Cemetery Ridge. So, General Lee now begins Phase 2 of his plan of his frontal attack, and he will use General Jeb Stuart and his cavalry to strike at Union forces behind their defense lines. Now, this is kind of an interesting story, because scouting on one of the ridges to see what Lee's plan is the Michigan cavalry. Okay? And they are obviously Union forces, right? So this small group of Michigan cavalry are witnessing General Stuart's end run. They're watching him make this run. And the only thing that stands between Stuart's cavalry and that unprotected back flank of the Union forces at Cemetery Ridge is the Michigan cavalry. They're the only thing that's going to be able to stop them. Does that make sense? They're not going to be as big. Matter of fact, they're only going to have 400 cavalrymen in comparison to the nearly 5,000 that Stuart has. The benefit for the Michigan cavalry, kiddos, is they are commanded by a brash 23-year-old general by the name of George Armstrong Custer. Ring a bell? Commander that was annihilated by Native Americans at Little Bighorn later. So George Armstrong Custer, just a brash 23-year-old general, is going to be the man responsible with his Michigan cavalry to stop this advance by Jeb Stuart and his much larger cavalry. So General Custer, with just 400 men, orders his cavalry to attack Stuart's 5,000 men, despite the fact they're outnumbered like 10 to 1. He asks them to attack them. And as they're attacking, he shouts out to his men, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Now the other class, Wyatt Wyman just snapped that right up.
Is that the college?
Michigan Wolverines, the college. That's where they get their name. The cavalry unit, Michigan Wolverines, right? University of Michigan Wolverines. Well, as Custer is ordering his 400 men to attack Stuart's 5,000 men, he shouts to his men and leads the charge, by the way. He shouts out, "Come on, you Wolverines." Now, let's put this in perspective. If I'm driving my 2000, I think most of you know my pickup. Got a great big nice battering ram on the front, right? If I'm driving my pickup down the highway and I'm 5,000 cavalry and Tatum is driving her Mini Cooper, which is 400 cavalry, straight at me in a game of chicken, what am I thinking she's going to do? Yeah, she's going to pull off. I mean, she's not going to do that. She's not going to be foolish enough to do that. Well, Stuart watches this sight of 400 cavalrymen charging, I mean, straight, digging in their spurs and charging straight into his cavalry. And he thinks that Custer is bluffing, and he thinks he'll pull off at any time. Well, you know what? Tatum Zimmerman's Mini Cooper decides not to do that, and she finishes the game of chicken, and she slams into the 2009 F-250 pickup. And you're thinking, well, she's in trouble. Well, she might be in a little trouble, but the 7 or 8 cars behind me that she now initiates contact with my pickup because she stopped me in my tracks where they just kind of piled up. That's what happened to the cavalry. So he charges his men in, and they dig in their spurs, and they just launch into this cavalry of 5,000. And it looks like a railroad cars, you know, and when the engine hits and then the railroad cars go every which direction, that's what it looked like. Now you got to remember, these are men on horses, which are not always controllable. So here comes Custer with his 400. They dig in their spurs, and I mean, they just launch themselves into this much larger cavalry, which causes tremendous shock, first of all, and disorganization. And in the end, Custer gets some reinforcements in because somebody obviously was sent back to say, hey, look what's going on here. And by the time Custer gets those reinforcements, guess where Jeb Stuart's cavalry does not go? To the rear flank. They have been stopped, and that's why they're stopped on your map there. They never make it to the rear flank. Well, does General Lee know this? No, he doesn't. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, unaware that Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry is retreating, starts phase 3 of his plan. And that would be an infantry march straight into Cemetery Ridge, because who does he believe is on the back side? Stuart. And what's he think his cannons are doing from Seminary Ridge? Causing damage, which they are not, right? And what does he think's happening at Culp's Hill, or hoping that they're winning there? None of that is working, right? Yeah.
I just had a question. I heard someone say that if the Confederates had one pair of walkie-talkies during the battle, Gettysburg, they would have won?
Absolutely, because they could have communicated. Yeah, that's probably right. If you had walkie-talkies in those days, or cell phones, they could have said, well, guess what? We're not making it. And, you know, that's a good point. But that's a great point. But Lee doesn't know that. So what he does is he orders General George Pickett to lead a massive infantry of 13,000 men marching straight on Cemetery Ridge. Because he believes that Stuart is going to pinch him from the rear and they are going to split this Union forces in half. So here's your Cemetery Ridge, and here are all of these soldiers. Okay? I don't think we understand how many 13,000 is. But when they stretched out in their line to march, you know how long the line was? A mile long. Now, if you're the Confederates on top of Cemetery Ridge and you watch these massive troops, and what they're doing too is they think that the cavalry is going to come from this way and hit there, right? So as they march in, they're funneling in, and eventually this mile long is going to be 2 or 3, 5 soldiers deep, but they're going to be closer together. So they're marching in a funnel. Does that make sense? So Lee orders General Pickett to lead a massive infantry charge of 13,000 men directly into the center of Cemetery Ridge, and this charge will go down in American history as Pickett's Charge. Anybody do the report on George Pickett? Now they are marching across basically a farmer's field. A man owns this field, it's his farm, and that's what they're marching on. Who is leading Union forces on the top of Cemetery Ridge? Remember, Lieutenant, he already turned soldiers back once when they retreated early the first day. Lieutenant Frank Haskell is still on top of Cemetery Ridge commanding troops here. And what do they have on top of Cemetery Ridge besides soldiers, Kate? Cannons. And they are firing cannons into that farmland that's inhabited by 13,000 Confederate soldiers, and they're also waiting for them to get close enough to be in range of their rifles. Right now, all they're doing is marching on one side and firing cannons on the other, because there's no sense shooting your rifles because you're too far apart. Now, there's a fence line about halfway between where they started and Cemetery Ridge. And soldiers are going to have to get to that fence line before they're in range of each other. Does that make sense? Well, at 3:30 p.m., 30 minutes later, the Confederate soldiers, what are left of them, finally get to the fence line. Anybody want to guess what percentage of that 13,000 were either killed or wounded because of that cannon assault in the first 30 minutes? That's too little high, but 50%. They lost 50%. 6,500 soldiers were either killed or wounded before they ever got into range to shoot at each other because of the cannon fire. So at 3:30 p.m., Confederate soldiers finally reached that fence line where both sides are within range of each other's rifles, and in that 30 minutes of fighting, the Confederates had already lost 50%. Okay? Do they quit? The rebels quit. They just keep coming, and they just keep coming. They breach the fence, and they're starting to shoot a lot of Union soldiers. And what do those Union soldiers do as they witness this whole thing? Panic and begin to retreat. Okay? They begin to retreat. So as these Confederates persevere, and despite losing 50%, they continue to come, and they get to that fence line, and then these Union soldiers are starting to get shot at a pretty successful rate. These Union soldiers panic, and once the Confederates get over the top of this fence, the Union begins to retreat. They can't believe what they're seeing. These guys are still coming. Well, who's standing on the crest for the Union at Cemetery Ridge, just like he was before? Frank Haskell. and he watches these Union troops turn and run up towards the ridge. And he gets a little angry, and he orders those Union soldiers to turn and get back into the fight, and says, "Turn around and fire, or I will cut you down." Stating that you either turn around and fight, or I'll shoot you as you retreat up the hill. So Lieutenant Haskell orders the Union soldiers to turn and get back into the skirmish, yelling, "Turn around and fire, or I will cut you down." He's going to shoot his own men if they continue to retreat. Well, Stuart doesn't show up, so what are the Union going to bring to Cemetery Ridge now? Lots of reinforcements. So Union reinforcements arrive at Cemetery Ridge, and now the Confederate infantry is in trouble. Okay? Because they've already lost half, and the Union's getting reinforcements. So what would you do if you were the Confederates, not knowing that Stuart's been stopped? What might you do if you're taking some casualties on the other side of that fence? Might hunker down, right? And wait and see until they get there. And then get ready to get after it again. Well, what happens? They never get there. So what turned out as Pickett's charge quickly turns into Pickett's retreat. So the Confederates dig in desperately. They're waiting for Jeb Stuart and the cavalry to arrive. Obviously, they never appear. Once they figure out the cavalry's not coming, they turn, and Pickett's charge becomes Pickett's retreat. And the Confederates have lost the Battle of Gettysburg. The ironic thing about this, in the end,